right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. You have arrived at the last session for the day, at 3:45 to 4:30. Today we're going to be talking about forests and forestry guidance for local governments. And we're very happy to have a number of presenters here today. We have with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Forest Service, we have Ann Hairston-Strang, Acting State Forester for Department of Natural Resources Forest Service. And she'll be starting, but she also has with her today Dan Ryder and also Tom Bradshaw with DNR Forest Service. And after they are done, we're going to have Charles Rice with Charles County Planning and Growth Management. And I will final things up, Maryland Department of Planning, Jason Dubo. So without further ado, we appreciate your attention. And Ann, why don't you start with us all for today? Thank you.
I'm going to start with a round of applause for Jason for pulling this together.
Oh, yeah, here.
All right, can folks hear me in the back? Okay, great. All right, so we got a few minutes here to talk about forests. And I bet you everybody who's got a plan out there that has a vision in it, I bet you forests are somewhere in there somehow. So let's see, where's the clicker?
Whenever you tell me, yeah.
So I picked on Queen Anne's County since I live here, and we're here. So, and that is the pictures from Queen Anne's County too. But the first bullet in the vision, predominantly rural county, small towns connected by creeks, county roads through fields and forests. First thing you run, it is part of who we are and where we live in the Mid-Atlantic. And green stuff is good, we know that. And one of the reasons I went back for my PhD in forest hydrology is I wanted to really know why forests were good. What difference does it make whether you got grass out there or trees, or does it make a difference? And it does, in fact, make a difference. And I'm not going to go into too many technical details, although we can if somebody wants to later. But one of the biggest differences is infiltration. You know, how much time do we spend on worrying about stormwater runoff? How much money do we spend on worrying about water quality? I mean, we have some serious asks of our local jurisdictions around this kind of thing. Forests are your secret weapon for infiltration, for water quality filtration, and it's not just the leaves up above, that the soils, the rooting patterns in the soils, the forest floor layer, all of those are part of that whole system that works together to do the stormwater management, the infiltration, and storage. So, you know, you're not just building stormwater storage in your stormwater basins, you have it on your landscape. And so we have issues when we take it off the landscape. And so what's our big climate and water quality win? Expanding forests on our landscape. Forests are one of the natural land covers, predominant natural land cover in this area of the world. And the more that we can work with it and use it, the better off we will all be. And one of the things that I don't think I would have mentioned 20 years ago, the thermal differences. We're all becoming a lot more aware of the difference temperature makes, whether it's for air quality, you know, ozone generation, it gets triggered at high temperatures. What if in your urban setting you had more trees and you reduce that air temperature 10 degrees below the threshold for generating ozone? That makes a difference to the people living there. It makes a difference to the asthma rates there. It all ties together, And so the real joy of working with forests in the work that we do is building that multiplicity of functions. You've got the water quality, you've got the air quality, and we haven't even talked about habitat. One of the other things that we've been working on a lot more recently is climate and carbon. And we have a lot of folks that love trees. I love trees. And they really say, we need to keep all of our trees. And while it is true, we need to keep all of our forest area, trees are coming and going all the time. And we can't, stop that in its tracks. Again, we need to know how to work with it. And the U.S. Forest Service has done some comparison graphs here. So if we look at just, say that acre of forest back over there, and we cut it, those trees are gone, you can say, oh, we lost carbon storage. That's the graph right here. But one of the other things that is, if you remember your physics, those don't go away. We do something with the things that are harvested, and we use it to meet people's needs. Looking at the chairs in front of us, what happens if we don't use the wood we grow? We make it out of something else. So there's leakage and there's substitution. So either if you don't grow it where you use it, you're buying it from somewhere else and exporting your environmental impacts, or you're using different products, and most of the other products that we would use, plastic, steel, concrete, all of those have bigger climate and carbon footprints than our wood products industry. So the graph over by Jason shows what happens when you really factor in the different fates. Some of those wood products will have long duration and store carbon for decades. Some of them, like if we use it for wood energy or mulch, those are going to go back into the atmosphere sooner, but they will have displaced fossil fuels, or they will have helped with soil health or weed reduction. I mean, we really have to look at a systems perspective and consider not just the analysis of 1 acre, because the atmosphere doesn't see 1 acre, it sees the whole landscape. And we have to not consider just what's happening this year, but over the service lifetime of the things that we use and need. So our folks spend a lot of time in the woods, and regardless of what their personal belief system is, and I can tell you among our staff it varies significantly, they know that the woods have changed. And they have changed within the span of our careers. I spent a lot of time with my dad. He grew up in rural Virginia, wandering over thousands of acres. You know how many deer he saw in that whole time growing up? And I'm like, what? Deer were almost extinct in the 20s and 30s. They were reintroduced to Maryland. They are a conservation success story beyond our wildest imagination. So we have a lot more deer than we did historically, even if that was a historic low, what we're looking at now, because we have other food sources and we have reduced hunting pressure. We've taken, some of the big predators off the landscape. We've taken fire off the landscape. I don't really want fire ripping through my parents' backyards or my kids or whatever. We need to do that because of our settlement patterns. But it affects our woods. We're not California, but some of the same kind of pressures that are going on in California, we have evidence of those in Maryland too. We work with prescribed fire to get some of the ecological benefits on the landscape and do fuel reduction, but it still changed the woods. So we've got more deer, less fire, and we've added a lot of invasive species with global trade. So with those changes, those ecological changes, just letting nature take its course, drawing the line and walking away, we don't get what we used to. And we can see it every day on the roadsides as we go by our woods now. People are sort of realizing what the impacts are. The other thing that we are still facing is forest loss. This isn't a equal scale, but it does show the pattern of declining loss. The Forest Conservation Act started around 1991, really got into the ordinances mid-90s. And you can see that it's made a difference in the numbers of forests that we see on the land. Go ahead. We're still losing forest in our developing areas. And the Harry Hughes Center for Agroecology and Chesapeake Conservancy worked on a really significant study on forest canopy, forest and tree canopy last year, and this is taken from that. So if you want tons of details about forest and tree canopy loss and gains, and please go to that study. It's available on the Harry Hughes Center and Chesapeake Conservancy websites. But the point I'd like to make today, our developed area, we're seeing huge losses. That large green bar is forest. The lighter green is tree canopy, less than an acre of forest. Where's the one place where we're actually seeing a net gain in forest? It's the lower eastern shore. Guess where we have the most active forest industry in the state? Okay. I didn't make up these numbers. I didn't collect these numbers. But I know why there's more forest there. So, next. And the other point I want to make sure everybody understands in the room is that there are a lot of regulations that we already have today around forests. I mean, not even getting into the developed regulations. When we're talking about keeping forests on the landscape and using the wood for good, we need some regulations to make sure we're not doing environmental harm while we do our management. We have some of the strictest sediment erosion control regulations on the East Coast. The authority lies with Maryland Department of the Environment. DNR puts people on the ground to make sure there's eyes on some of those jobs. Many of you have a role in helping regulate that, and the soil conservation districts. We have separate regulations around waterway crossings implemented through those. If you have forest industry, if you're burning wood or or processing wood, we have air quality regulations that have to be met. Dan and Tom work together on our forest product operator's license. A license is required and you can lose a license. We have the master logger program out there. We have safety regulations that all of those businesses have to meet. And then we have zoning on top of that, which Jason will go into more in terms of how some of that may sometimes have impacts that we don't necessarily understand and that may be working at cross purposes. Okay, Dan?
Sure.
So Dan Ryder's our Forest Stewardship and Utilization Program Manager. And if you haven't been on a tour with him yet, see what tours he's doing and sign up.
Thanks, Ann. So my name's Dan Ryder. I work for Ann. I'll skip the bio. Let's just get right into this. So something I think everybody in the room will instantly recognize is the forest industry provides the markets for the management and the caretaking of the forest, okay? Think back to the three pillars of sustainability: ecological, community, economic. The forest industry is the linchpin, it's the center of being able to capture all three of those with 40% of the landscape in Maryland, which is forested. So just hitting some highlights here. It's not a small industry. I don't think anybody would think of Maryland as a quote-unquote timber state. We're not Maine, we're not Minnesota, we're not Mississippi. We're Maryland. That said, it's still it's over a $3 billion industry. It employs a few thousand people directly. It employs tens of thousands of people indirectly. Monday, I was on a tour in southern Maryland, and we visited a very small sawmill. Owner was asked, how many employees does he have? He said, including himself, he had 9 employees. Small operation. Then he went on to say that when you start adding in all the truck drivers, the mechanics, the welders, on down the list, it's more like 80 to 90 people that have their job based on that one little mill, okay? So this is the same kind of impact that you see rolling around everywhere you go across Maryland. We're really blessed in Maryland because we have a very diverse forest. We also have a very diverse forest industry. We have fairly large mills. We have very, very teeny, tiny mills. You can even call them hobbyists, but they're all very important. We also have, I guess for today's purposes, let's just call them non-traditional mills. Instead of making lumber, they're making wood chips. Where do those go? Those go up to a paper mill. Some energy. We even have a plant here in Maryland that makes, get this, wood flour. And what do they use wood flour for? Back in the old days, there used to be a brand of bread called Wonder Bread. And believe it or not, some of their flour was found in that loaf of bread. Today it's mainly going into plastics and explosives. How cool is that, right? Anyway, the point I'm trying to make, it's very diverse. And then that diversity, it expands vertically as well. So you have the raw material, comes out of the forest as a result of that landowner wanting to do some management work to achieve a specific outcome. Usually it's wildlife related. Or the landowner's recognizing that the forest isn't as healthy as it could and should be. It needs some work done, and that work costs a lot of money. So the strategy is well, let's utilize the products that come as my terminology here, as a byproduct of doing that good work in the woods. Let's use the value of the products that are created while we're in there thinning the woods or getting rid of the invasives or whatever it is that we need to do. And then the value of those products is what pays for all that good work to happen. And if there's no saleable product available, then you have less good work happening. On the flip side, there's another avenue here. If that landowner understands that there will be a future benefit from doing the good work today, that landowner is then more inclined to go ahead and write the check and get it done. As soon as that landowner loses confidence that there will be no return on the investment, it all stops. Because it doesn't make economic sense, right? Next slide, Jason. So I kind of touched on a lot of the topics here in this slide. You probably can't even see it in the back. Basically, what we're talking about is the life cycle, how the life cycle of the forest and forest products and the market providing the financial incentive, but more importantly, the financial means to go out and take care of the forest itself, how that relates back to the landscape. So, if I were to ask, and I'm not going to do this, but if I were to ask for a poll, raise your hand kind of thing, where would you expect to find healthier forests, Garrett County or Montgomery? And I'm not trying to disparage or elevate any one county here. It's just point of fact. Garrett County, the forests are generally, by and large, much more healthy than they are in Montgomery. It's not enough to say that the land is covered in trees and we've accomplished our mission. That forest is an organism, and is it healthy or not? That's what we're really trying to get at here. And the key, again, I'm stressing this one intentionally because it cannot be overstated. Without the markets, you lose the ability to provide that caretaking. It's just that simple. So there's a lot of additional benefits other than, somebody having a job, which I think everybody that has a job is glad to have it. There are benefits to the community at large. We're Maryland. This is a forested environment that we live in. We're not West Texas. Our natural habitat here is forest. So we should be a woodland-based culture. And we should have just a endemic understanding that, we're going to live here, we're going to work here, we're going to go about our daily lives within the forest. Keeping that forest intact, keeping it healthy, is not just something that happens by accident. That's a deliberate choice that we need to make. Next slide, please. So, Ann talked a lot about the carbon cycle. Basically, here's how it works. It's just like a bank account. Let me use a better analogy. It's what I call the magic of forestry. So you go out into the woods, you select a few trees, chop them up, chop them down, haul them off to the mill, and then it goes through, anywhere from 5 to 50 different additional processes. Some of that wood might turn into a chair, some of it might be the building, on and on down the line, right? Turn it into a solid product. That's all that carbon being captured. Meanwhile, what's happening back out in the woods? They grow back. They always grow back. The question is what do they grow back as? That's where people get to make the decision, well, what do you want in the future? But if you do nothing, and I can promise you this, if you stop cutting that grass outside that window, in 5 years, you will have a beautiful forest. Because remember, we're Maryland. This is a woodland environment. So, harvest some, retain that product, long-lived product. That's all that carbon being locked up. Meanwhile, we're growing more wood. And we just repeat that. And by the way, we've been repeating that cycle for 400 years and we haven't run out of forest yet. And we're not going to. Next slide, please. So my point that I'm trying to make is, it's not just about somebody making money. And it's not just about ensuring that we keep as many jobs in our communities as possible. It's also good for the environment. It's like probably the single, not me saying this, I've seen a lot of other people way smarter than me say this. It is the single best land use from an environmental perspective. So, where markets matter. I think I've covered all that, so we can move on to the next slide. Oh, well, that's that.
So I think what we'd like to do is move to a more local example, right?
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, Charles, do you want to go?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Rice, Planning Director in Charles County. Kind of interesting, Ann's talk earlier in her reference to deer and when there were none. I can remember my father telling me as a kid that they would jump up from the dinner table when somebody thought they saw one to go see if they could get a glimpse of it. You know, so he remembers when they were first introduced here, and now we just hope to get home without running over one, right?
Right.
All right, so I was asked to come in and give a talk, give a little local perspective on forestry. Obviously, the two presenters before me talked about how important the forest industry is and the services that forests provide. So I hope to give you a little bit of an example of how to incorporate forest protection into your local comprehensive plans and some of the things that Charles County has done. So Charles County last updated its comprehensive plan in 2016, and we're about to embark on our next update. Our last plan was the first real time that we incorporated a specific chapter that included agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in its own chapter, and those three natural resource-based industries. And forestry, of course, was an important part of that. So that really set the stage for our future comprehensive plans, and we hope to add more content to this section. I will say that when we did this, it was a bit of a struggle to find data, especially up-to-date data about the forest industry, especially localized to the county, to indicate how important it is, like what the value is, and real stats that an everyday reader could pick up and it would resonate with them. So that's one of the things that we could do going forward, is to try to come up with better up-to-date information to beef up our comp plans and things like that, to really to put that message out there. Next slide, please. So how many in the room have some connection to Charles County, have done some kind of work there, have family there, know a little bit about Charles County? All right, a few of us. So this is a graphic of all the counties in the state of Maryland by percent forest cover. And you don't really think of Charles County as a forest county, but Charles County is actually the third most forested county in the state of Maryland, only behind Allegheny and Garrett County. That's kind of surprising to most folks. So obviously that industry is important to us, not only as a business, but for the natural resource services that it provides. Next slide. So some of the things that we do to help promote or protect that as an industry, when you look at our zoning ordinance, the use of sawmills is permitted by right in all three of our rural zones: agriculture conservation, rural conservation, and watershed conservation district. Those are the zones that contain the most land area. It's also permitted by right in our commercial village zone and the light and heavy industrial zones, which covers a vast amount of the county. Next slide. When you look at our zoning, and I know it's hard to see this, but essentially the white, the green, and the blue are those rural zones that sawmills are permitted by right. And you can see that is the majority of the county, probably more than 3/4. Next slide. So aside from including things in your zoning ordinance that protects the industry itself, obviously the other next best thing is preserving the resource itself. Next slide. So one of the things that came out of our last comprehensive plan update, and as many of you know, most comprehensive plan updates are not an easy process. They come with a lot of controversy and debate. And there was much of that when we last updated our comprehensive plan. One of the things that the Department of Natural Resources did for us is came to us and said, hey, I think you guys might need a little help, and we're looking to do a pilot project to conduct an eco-services assessment. And we said, yeah, why not? I think that would be good for us. And the outcome was a comprehensive assessment of the natural resources in the county and putting a dollar figure to them as to what they're actually worth for all the services that they're doing. Next slide. And this is a summary of that report. And essentially what it did, it looked at several elements of what natural resources provide, and they included carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat and biodiversity, air quality, stormwater mitigation, groundwater recharge, nutrient uptake, and agriculture. And when you combined all of those things together and mapped them, the areas that are in blue and the darkest green or lightest green are the areas where, when you take in all of those elements, they are the most highly productive areas and the areas providing the most ecosystem services and what should be protected. And what you see really light up, if you're familiar with Charles County, you have the Zakiah Swamp Run watershed, that long linear blue area, largest hardwood swamp forest on the East Coast, and I believe the most biologically diverse ecosystem in the state of Maryland. You also have the Mattawoman watershed that lights up on the western side, northwestern side of the county, and also pretty much the entire western side of the county, either in blue and green. And if you're familiar with Charles County, you should instantly kind of relate those areas to something. And what are they? It's forest. All of those things light up, even though it was, those 7 or 8 elements. The primary reason why they are most important is all tied back to forestry and those forest resources. Hearing the presentation prior to this from the Native American perspective, the other thing that kind of resonates to me, and this is only after hearing your talk, the beaver, Zakiah, Mattawoman, and forest, all coming back and related to exactly what you told us. So, we'll take home message today. Next slide. So in our comprehensive plan, there are several things that are in there that help target preservation. One is priority preservation areas. So our plan designates 2 large areas in the county that are a priority for preservation and where we target preservation funding. And again, they are the western side of the county, heavily forested, and also the southeast part of the county, which is a lot of agriculture and forest land. Next slide. For those of you that are familiar with the septic tier mapping, that was a mandate from the state several years ago to designate your land area in tiers, which ultimately dictates where major and minor subdivisions can go. And you'll see Tier 4 is the most restrictive and can only allow minor subdivisions, and you can see that's the vast majority of the county. So another very protective measure for our forest industry. Next slide. Then we look at our land preservation programs, the programs that actually use funding to purchase development rights or conservation easements to permanently preserve the land. And one of our primary programs is the state's Rural Legacy Program, enacted by the state in 1997, essentially allocates grant funding to local jurisdictions or land trusts to buy land or development rights for permanent preservation. And we currently have 2 large rural legacy areas that have been designated or expanded over time. One is the Zakiah Watershed Rural Legacy Area, and was more recently expanded down to the southern part of the county, down towards Cobb Island, and several thousand acres preserved within that area through rural legacy and county funding. And then most recently, within the last couple of years, we designated a new rural legacy area on the western side, known as the Nanjemoy-Mattawoman Forest Rural Legacy Area. And it was designated primarily because of the forest resource there and preserving that. Next slide. Our other go-to program is the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, also known as MALF. Been in existence for over 40 years now, housed within the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And its primary focus is to preserve productive farmland. And next slide, we'll kind of get into some information on that. When you look at how many properties that we've preserved in Charles County through that program, about 97 properties, almost 14,000 acres to date. And again, spread throughout the county, but largely within those priority preservation areas. Next slide. One of the criticisms in the past of that program, because it's called Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program, a lot of folks, and even folks in the elected officials, think, well, that program is only preserving agricultural land. What about the forest resources? We're allocating a lot of money, and it's not going to preserving forest. So we were asked to, in an effort to try to refute that idea, look at the actual land use of the properties that we had in preservation at a given time. And we looked at almost 7,000 acres, and what is it that we're actually preserving in that 7,000 acres? And when you look at that, it was very revealing to us that 70% of those properties, or 70% of the land area of those properties was actually forest, and 27% cropland and pasture, and 3% wetland. And that exactly matches up to where you see us as being 70% forested when compared to all the other Maryland counties. So it was very in tune to preserving exactly what's on the ground and what exists, and had nothing to do with the title of that program. It's all soils based and the land mass that you have in your county. Next slide. So just kind of bringing that home, this is our protected lands map across the county as of 2023, with all of those programs in place, along with the private land trusts, Nature Conservancy, all of these things coming together to preserve many thousands of acres in the county, much of which is aimed at protecting the forest resource, not only for the industry, but for all the services that it provides. So hopefully that gives you some information about how that gets incorporated into local plans and how you might do that in your own jurisdiction.
All right, thank you all for bearing with us. I got my technical difficulties here with my presentation. All right, thanks for everybody for being here today. So as we had first couple presenters, we had DNR give really a big overview of the importance of forests for the economic, environmental purposes, and actually it is advancing a bit here, Joe. Oh, thank you. And then the second, of course, presentation from Charles Rice, talking about how Charles County has specifically helped to support forests and forestry. There it is, it's working perfectly now. And so this third presentation is about a new guidance document just finalized at the end of last year, called the Forestry Guidance to Local Governments, that our department put together, and with a lot of guidance from DNR Forest Service and others. We're going to talk about that next. So next slide, please. So the primary audience for this guidance document is our local planning and zoning officials and staff, including planning commission members. And really there's three major contents of the guidance and purposes of it. The first one is that it educates about the many facets of the forestry industry. As planners, and as surveys have been done, Tom Bradshaw, who's here today from DNR Forest Service, did survey of local planners throughout the state. And there's a big need for education about what is the forestry industry, what are the different aspects of it. So that's one of the things that this guidance document works to achieve. A second comprehensive part of it is to talk about all the different Maryland laws and regulations that the forestry industry is governed by. Next slide, please. And thirdly, the other aspect of it gets into some of the nuts and bolts about how planning and zoning at the local level could be adjusted to support the forestry industry while also supporting other community needs as well. One thing that's interesting is that there's actually in state statute a particular vision for planning and zoning at the local level and how it connects to forestry. So the quote here is from the Natural Resources article. It says, since it is in the state and public interests to preserve the forest, land base, and other natural resources, a local government with planning and zoning powers shall support forestry by a reasonable exercise of these powers, including the consideration, development, and interpretation of planning and zoning requirements that beneficially impact the efficient and economic practice of forestry. So this guidance document in a way is meant to support that statutory vision. Next slide. Okay, so the first component, as I talked about, is education about the many facets of the forestry industry. So one of the things it does is provides definitions of really a different language that the forestry industry speaks that us as planners have to understand so that we can try to shape planning and zoning in a way that's supportive of it. So we have one appendix that provides definitions of all the different forestry-related items and terms to help local planners understand the complexities and subtleties of the industry. Next slide. So forestry practices, forestry as a whole, really, we think of it as three different subject areas. As you can think of it as a cycle. The first part of the cycle is the forestry management practices themselves, caring for the forest and keeping it healthy and productive, including stewardship and conservation. So as Ann and Dan showed on their slides, that's kind of like the first 20 or 40 years of the forests. And then the second component of that is the timber harvesting aspect of it. And the third aspect is after you've harvested timber, doing all the multiple processing and manufacturing steps to create a variety of wood products, whether it's logs or mulch, stove pellets, or fine furniture. Next slide. The guidance also talks about who is involved in the industry, whether there's loggers, there's growers, there's foresters, there's manufacturers, whether they're the primary manufacturers or secondary manufacturers. There's distribution yards. There's a variety of forest products out there as well. So we just try to teach about all the different aspects of the forestry industry. So forest products are not just lumber, but it includes pulpwood, bark, chips and shavings, pilings and poles, even sawdust and pellets and mulch and biomass. Next slide, please. And then to really, again, the guidance document to try to get us as planners to understand all these different aspects, trying to get into some of the specific equipment that's used and types of facilities you might see out there. So there are kilns at the larger scale that dry lumber. There's stump yards, there's chip mills, and there are specific manufacturing plants that are focused on producing furniture or other wood products. Next slide. Okay, so that's like the first major component of the guidance document. The second, which I won't get into too much because Ann and Dan talked about it, is trying to give an understanding comprehensively of all the laws and regulations that govern the forestry industry. So it gives a little bit about the history of the forest governance, and then it talks about sediment and erosion control requirements, and I think also importantly, it talks about the Forest Conservation Act. And so it tries to dispel which is commonly misunderstood aspect, but the Forest Conservation Act does not apply to the forestry industry, and that's something that's just important to keep in mind. Next slide. Forestry industry is also regulated through other aspects, such as when it does prescribed burning, when there are pesticides or herbicides applied. You may be concerned about transportation and vehicles that are transporting lumber, but they also are regulated as well as noise control. Next slide. And then, in addition to regulatory aspects, there's a voluntary management aspect of things. Department of Natural Resources Forest Service, as is talked about in the guidance document as well, has a whole other program called the Forest Conservation and Management Program, and it talks to landowners and licensed professional foresters are involved to encourage the development and use of forest management plans and forest stewardship plans. They represent a legal agreement between the landowner and DNR in which the landowners agree to manage their forest land in accordance with a management plan prepared for that property. Again, prepared by a professional forester. So when certain trees reach a certain type of in certain areas managed under the plan have reached their desired size or maturity, then harvesting can occur in those particular areas. So the major third component of the guidance document gets into the nuts and bolts about planning and zoning. You can stay on this slide, but I just wanted to say first that what I said earlier about the three categories of forestry, the forest management part, the timber harvesting part, and the creation of wood products part, each of those stages in the process can be impacted by local planning and zoning decisions. And I'm going to get a couple of brief examples here related to sawmills. Sawmills in certain zones, for example, at the local level, let's say in a industrial, commercial, or rural zone, sometimes at the local level, they may be only required, sawmill may only be allowed under a special exception. And those local governments sometimes may require that landowner to come in, get a special exception every year to keep that sawmill on the property. And that's a type of example that could hinder the forestry industry from being successful in your jurisdiction. So one option is to allow that use by right in certain zones, and instead of requiring that special exception every time. Another example is that has to do with the source of wood for a sawmill on a property. In some jurisdictions, a sawmill on a property may be restricted in your code to only using wood from that property. But that restriction can make certain forestry ventures impossible, even though those ventures could be very beneficial to your local government and your forestry economy at the local level. So one option is to go into your code and allow that sawmill to make use of wood from other properties, not just from its own property. So that expands the geographic area from which the sawmill can make use of wood. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Thank you. So the key here is that your planning and zoning can support the markets for the raw materials themselves, the trees that Charles Rice had talked about. And by doing that, that can help determine really whether your forest landowners will have a financial incentive to retain that land as forest, or whether they want to pursue other types of land uses for that forest, such as development. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here's some more nuts and bolts. There's a few example tables in the guidance. They're not intended to be adopted as is, but they try to provide you an example of a wide variety of forestry-related uses. We have like maybe 20 different forestry-type uses in each table, and then that's on like the vertical side of the table, and then the horizontal side of the table is your different zoning types, whether it's a resource zone or industrial zone or agricultural zone or residential zone. And the table basically says whether that forestry-related use should or should not be allowed in there. So that's the first table, allowable uses within zoning district table. We also have a table later on that talks about minimum setbacks for each of those uses, for example. And we also, even though it's not online yet, we have a special exceptions table that we're hoping to put online soon. And it basically says for each of those types of forestry uses, we give some conditions for you to consider. If you're going to allow that type of use within that particular zoning district, what are the aspects for allowing a special exception? What are the conditions? So if you serve on a Board of Zoning Appeal, those are some conditions that you can look at when trying to make a decision whether to allow a forestry use in a particular zoning district. Oops, sorry, not just yet. A couple other interesting aspects is when you're trying to decide, when you're looking, let's say you're examining your zoning code, trying to decide if a particular forestry use belongs in agricultural type or resource or industrial type of zoning, category. So, forestry and agriculture are very similar in many situations. They both are growing crops in the soil, for example. The harvesting is on a different time frame, of course, and the amount of the crop size can be much larger. But some types of smaller scale processing of timber, lumber and logs, wood bricks or poles and things like that, it can make sense to accommodate those types of uses in an agricultural zone. So the scale matters. And the guidance talks about that issue of scale. And then you may have other issues where it does make sense to consider it for more industrial type purposes, like a larger type of project, for example. Next slide, please. Some more nuts and bolts is that we try to introduce some different zoning concepts. So not just your regular type of zoning, like rural or agricultural or industrial or commercial zones. We also talk about ideas, for example, that other jurisdictions are using in the country to accommodate forestry, such as an overlay zoning district, which, as you know, is basically a special district atop of your existing zoning districts, but it has, in this case, contained provisions for types of standards that can support the forestry industry, such as specific permitted, accessory, or conditional uses, building setbacks that make sense for forestry uses, etc. Another thing we talk about are some innovative forestry zoning ideas other jurisdictions have used, such as a rural industrial and manufacturing district that can accommodate a mix of forestry industry components, and then also a commercial forestry type district, which is more focused on, maybe say, the processing side of things for forestry. And that's really the gist of the guidance document. It gets through those nuts and bolts components. It gets through those description of the regulatory aspects the forestry industry is over, and most importantly as well, just educating about all the different components of what the forestry industry is, so us as planners can get to know it better, and by knowing it better can help to set up planning and zoning to better accommodate and support it. And that's it. And the next slide is just, that's the special exceptions section I talked about, but if you have any questions, we're all here to support you. And I know we ran a little bit late, but if there's a little bit of time, I think between here and 5:30, if we want to take any questions. Okay, and yeah. So if anybody have any questions for us, we have all these experts here on the panel for you. So
Question up here, and then I'll come back.
Okay, thank you.
What do you do when it comes to preventing fires in these lumber yards and stuff? What regulations do you have?
For preventing what now?
Fires. You know, like forest fires, something. What do what are the regulations?
Probably the single greatest incentive for a mill owner to avoid that fire is the insurance premium, right? So the insurance companies really drive home the need for sanitation in the mill. If you sweep up at the end of the day, you're going to do a really nice job of not having a fire. That said, things do happen. So the building codes are now requiring flash detectors. So there's a technological solution. Depend.
About wildfire outside?
Yeah.
You'll be next.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, this industry it's multi-scalar. So we have really small operators, which is a good thing. We also have some really large ones. So the larger you are, there's like a threshold. Once you get larger than a certain point, then some really tight regulations start applying to you. So.
Thank you. So in Baltimore County, in western Baltimore County specifically, we have a couple of operations for manufacturing wood. One of them is dedicated firewood operation. I mean, does that fall within woodlands manufacturing? Just producing firewood, having logs hauled in specifically for splitting firewood. Thank you.
So, yeah, firewood is part of our forest products, and it's, part of how we live on the land, right? A firewood operator needs a forest product operator's license. And so that's available for, how much is it? $20. Okay, it's not a high bar if you ask somebody to get a forest product operator's license, but it is something that can be taken away, and it is a point of regulation. And it is part of the industry that is right-sized for Maryland. We do not have the fiber basket to have the next big 2x4 mill in the U.S. they're not interested. But a firewood operation, if you do these things right, if you provide education, if you provide good market incentives, it can be a big part of a path to healthy forests that balances, these changes in ecology, the fire suppression, and still, to the gentleman's point, managing some of our wildfire risk. If you're in western Baltimore County, you also were aware of the Soldier's Delight fire this spring. Okay, that was a big wake-up call for us. We hadn't seen anything like that in a decade. So the fire risk is real. Some of our electrification trends, which are also real and are going to happen, and we need to have some of that happen. It also changes our fire risk and how we are going to have to respond on the landscape. So things are connected. Does that get towards what you were looking for? Okay.
I see a few more hands. These will be
Let's
the
add
last.
another aspect to that firewood processor. If everybody remembers Martin O'Malley's Zero Waste Initiative, no more landfills, that firewood processor is an outlet for the tree experts that would ordinarily have to get rid of their tree waste in the landfill.
We are also, Western Baltimore County is also member of the legendary Janet Stump fire. So we know a little bit about the processing on that side.
So that's another avenue that, again, allows two businesses to work together and help each other out.
Okay, I see four. I saw four more hands, and that's going to have to be it. They'll be after you.
Regarding select cut forest harvest permits, how important is it to maintain or spare from the chopping block, if you will, the best trees in that permitted area, so the seeds or the acorns or whatever can regenerate the area with the better trees, so you don't get just because they want to harvest the best trees, okay? So you leave some of the best ones there so they can reproduce genetically. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so what you're touching on is the core of forestry. So we're professional foresters. What you're describing is a term that we call high grading. Go in and you cut the best and you leave the rest. It's a terrible practice. It's awful. We try to do whatever we can do to discourage that from happening. The best way to discourage that from happening is to provide a market for that lower value wood. That way the logger needs to make the money. So if all that is available for that logger in terms of having a place to sell wood is the very best trees, well, then that's what he's going to cut. He's going to walk by the lower value trees or the no value tree, right? Loggers don't get paid to cut trees. They get paid when they deliver wood. If they don't have a place to sell it, they're not going to cut it. And they'll leave it in the woods. And if it's little junk today, my term junk, right? It's just going to be bigger junk tomorrow.
Makes sense, I just spent and they spare here and there.
Yeah, so
The better the market, the better the
the
education.
better the better your markets, the more diverse your markets, the better forestry you end up with. And as a forester, I can tell you it's not so much about deciding which trees to cut. It's more important to decide which trees not to cut. Yeah, good question.
I just have one question. Senate Bill 526, the Tree Solutions Now Act, how will it affect forestry, and is there any update on that?
What was the last part of the question?
Is there any update on that?
On the Forest Conservation Act?
Yes.
Yeah. We have received some of the applications for the alternative qualified reforestation. So those are going to be evaluated before the end of the year. J.T. Bowers is now our lead for Urban and Community Forestry and our 5 Million Trees Act. So we have our 5 Million Trees team mostly together, and we will be standing up some of the progress on the Tree Solutions Now Act. We do not have at this time any of the new standards. One of the things that I would very much welcome is, as we do move forward with developing the new standards, I mean, there was a lot of changes that bill did for the Forest Conservation Act. We're going to be producing a manual by the end of next year, and it's not great timing with some of you all's requirements. We understand that, but we also know that, you know, we're not going to produce a glib document and that's not going to meet the larger needs. There's a lot of complex interactions here. We are going to get some assistance with the revision of the technical manual. And so I would certainly invite any advice on what you would want to see changed in the existing technical manual, and what kind of places would you want it vetted as we go, you know, through next year, developing that with some contracted assistance.
There's a question in here. I think you have a question? And you'll be the last.
For Charles County, the accounting for ecosystem services, I thought was interesting. I picked up on the value that was given to resources, and I know we talk about that a lot, but it's not necessarily, I don't see it done a whole lot. And I was just curious if you guys use that practically in any of your permitting and or mitigation requirements, like, you know, weighting the resources in some sort of way.
So I think for us, and we were one of the first ones that assessment was done for, and I think since then the state has gone on to do eco-services assessments for several other counties in the state, I believe. One of the things that did for us was, you know, as planners on the ground, and I've worked for Charles County for, it'll be 25 years in December, and born and raised there. So for all those reasons, you know, you have a good sense of what is important to protect and why, and we can preach that all day to the elected officials, and they take it or leave it. So one of the things that assessment did for us was, it was a look from someone from the outside, from a scientific point of view, and said, hey, we ran this extensive GIS exercise and applied science, and here's what it told us as to what is important for you to preserve and why, and applied some numbers to it, some actual dollars. And it gave us the opportunity to say, hey, it verifies what we've been saying for years. Look at where we recommended priority preservation areas. Look at the areas that we said were most important to preserve, and it was because of the forest resources, the wetlands, and all those things that come with it. So it was kind of an eye raiser to the elected officials and others to say, hey, what they've been telling us was right. They weren't just making it up or just because they believed it was a good thing to do. So it was a good tool for us in that regard. For those counties that have stormwater permits, MS4 permits, where we're required to do mitigation that costs hundreds, if not millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands or millions, it also targets those projects as well, so that we can not only preserve resources that are there, but spend those significant dollars in areas where we're getting multiple areas of protection for different reasons. So land preservation while doing mitigation or restoration that's needed. So accomplishing multiple goals. But I would say that assessment was a great tool for us just to hold up and be evidence from another source as to why we need to do a lot of things.
On the subject of rural legacy, MALF, similar programs like that,
strikes me that good planning requires being able to be flexible to adapt to needs that change over time, and restrictive easements that lock a given piece of land into a particular use in perpetuity run directly counter to that. Is there any reason that these programs could not work equally well if instead of perpetual easements they were 25, 50, or even 100 if need be year easements? So you can maintain those preservation and the flexibility at the same time.
Sure. And I've been in the field for quite some time, and that question has come up because the main reason, a lot of the folks that sold their easements in the early years of the program, especially with MALF, they sold their easements in the early 1980s for what now is considered to be very, very little money if you were the landowner that did that. So it's a one-time shot at selling your development rights, and you're right. Some folks say, well, maybe it should be a term easement where you have another crack at doing that. It hasn't gained much traction. I'm sure it will be a conversation that goes into the future. I will say that the programs have adapted over time to allow more uses as things change, as management practices for forests change, and the industry demands new ideas and new things. They incorporate those uses and those allowances within the easements, whether they're an older easement or newer easement. So they make those changes in state regulations to allow it, even though your specific easement document that was early on may not specifically call it out and say that it is. So they do adapt over time to some degree, but you're right, it is a one-time shot.
A lot of the easements today they require a forest management plan. They don't require a particular practice. So it does allow them to continue to use it for crops, for values, and you can respond to existing conditions. You're not stuck with a particular practice. Yeah, so I've spent most of my career working on Chesapeake Bay issues. We need BMPs across all of our land uses, but if we're not doing something that's going to keep a lot of our watershed rural, I'm not sure how we're going to get there. If we can keep a lot of our watershed rural, if we can realize the vision that's in a lot of our comprehensive plans on having viable rural areas, with a rural economy, these resource-based industries. I mean, we see it on the land. We can make that kind of restoration happen, even while we meet people's needs with it. So that protection from development's really a big deal.
Yeah, and I would say, to date, the land preservation programs have been voluntary, and the payments are significant. But as we've seen with a lot of things, if voluntary stuff doesn't work, it tends to become mandatory in law and regulation, and we see more of that. So the more that the land preservation programs can be funded and remain voluntary, and yet flexible to evolve over time with changes, yet maintain the intent. The intent of those programs are to preserve agriculture, farmland, woodland. It isn't the intent to get paid to preserve today, but develop 20 years from that time period. So it is a preservation program with that goal, voluntary, and landowners going into that with that knowledge and expectation.
I just want to thank everybody for being here today and all of your questions. We hope you learned a lot, and if you are looking for the forestry guidance to local governments, it is on the Maryland Department of Planning's website. And I just want to thank all of our presenters today, Ann Harrison Strang, Dan Ryder, Charles Rice, and then Tom Bradshaw. Thank you for being here today as well as part of our panelists. Yes, please.
I spent 8 years as a policymaker in Dorchester, and between the county councils, commissioners, and planning and zoning departments and planning commissioners, we set the tone for the land use and tax base in our counties. And by doing this together with Maryland Department of Planning, we're hoping that you can use this document as a way to go back, and it's a balancing act of land use, landowners' rights, and environmental protection. We all want a clean Chesapeake Bay. We all want healthy air, but we definitely need a tax base in our counties in order to provide the services that our citizens expect of us, and also the land use rights that the landowners expect to have in the long run. So at the end of the day, we hope that you can use this document that Dan, myself, and Ann, and Jason, and his team all collaborated on to go back and look at how forest industry can be added into your comprehensive plans and used going forward to protect the bay, protect our forests, and generate income for the landowners and a tax base for the county. That's our hope.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thank you all today. We'll talk to you all later. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.